we're potentially moving into a situation where there could be a Bernie Sanders presidency. Now, I don't want to, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but it can happen. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how that could potentially impact Canada. Let's say Bernie Sanders does become president. What sort of impact would that have on politics in Canada, or would it have any impact at all? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about this. I'm actually, writing a piece for a publication right now where this is one of the things that I've been thinking about for the piece. So this lines up really well. I think, well, on the whole, the first things first, every American president has an immense impact on Canada. Like every president has. So like Bernie will be no different in that general sense. The United States is the world's biggest superpower in pretty much every single way. And so the American president matters to everybody, but especially because we neighbor them for thousands of kilometers, and the majority of our trade goes to the United States, and a big chunk of their trade goes to us, but not nearly to the same dependency. Any American president matters. So, Bernie Sanders will matter and will affect things. Now, the question is, how will Bernie Sanders affect things? And I think it will embolden progressives in Canada. For a long time here in Canada, especially when like a really bad Republican is president, but not even just then. There's a kind of smug complacency among Canadians, which is to say we're better than the United States, ergo we're good enough. Sure, 1 million Canadians can't get their medication. Sure, hundreds of Canadians die a year because they can't get their medication. Sure, 6 million Canadians can't get access to dental care. But at the end of the day, we have some part of our health care covered through a universal single payer plan, so it's great. Or, the United States overrepresents African Americans about 3 times in prisons relative to their populations. The Americans are clearly more racist than us. Then again, when you look at the data, Indigenous people are 6 times the population in prisons in Canada vis-a-vis their general population. So there's this sense in Canada that even when we're worse than the Americans on an issue, because I think our treatment of Indigenous people in some ways is more systemically racist than African Americans' treatments in some ways, but we just think we're better because axiomatically we're better than the states. And I think that a Bernie Sanders presidency, even if he doesn't achieve all of his goals, but if Bernie wipes student debt, makes public universities and colleges free, that's something that no Canadian province has, that we don't have in Canada. Even Quebec, where they have like lower tuition rates, you still got to pay tuition. You still get student debt in some cases. Universal pharmacare and dental care. Quebec sort of, in a way, has pharmacare, but nationally, Canadians don't have access to dental care or pharmacare as part of our healthcare plan. Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All would include it. And so I think that whether it's on social programs, whether it's on fighting racial injustice, whether it's on like a worker and environmental, centric trade, regime, Bernie Sanders will move, not just the United States to the left, but the world to the left in some ways. And I do feel that like it will show Canadians like this narrative that like you have to vote liberal to stop conservatives because Canadians, you can't elect a left-wing government. It'll blow that out of the water because if Bernie Sanders can win the Democratic nomination, and he can, and win the presidency, and he can, the data's there, then Jagmeet Singh could become prime minister. And I think that, with a Singh, prime minister and, a Bernie Sanders presidency, then like we could do some really, really good things in North America. And Alamo in Mexico, like imagine the trade deals, imagine the focus on increasing unionization. This is key. Like often in Canada, we focus on like outsourcing of our jobs to the developing world, right? And it's often unfortunately tinged with elements of like xenophobia and racism. But often our jobs get outsourced to right to work states in the USA. Like the auto jobs don't just leave for Mexico or for Asia, they leave for Alabama.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
Because Alabama, like, they don't have unions. Like they don't have as many unionized workers in those industries there. Bernie Sanders wants to double the unionization rate. I personally think it's one of the most undercovered things about Bernie's campaign is his worker policy. Like it's really undercovered both by his his enemies and by his supporters. But like, if Bernie Sanders raises standards of work conditions in the US, which are lower than in most of Canada, that'll help Canadian workers too. So I'm like super excited for a Bernie presidency because like I'd like to think a good person. I want to see hundreds of millions of Americans have a better life. But as a selfish Canadian, I want us to actually look to the U.S. and if we want to be smug about it, we'll actually have to do something to maintain our moral superiority. And that's only going to happen if Bernie wins.
I think that's exactly right. And also, just take it a full circle here, I also don't think we would see what happened in Venezuela with Guaido. That wouldn't have happened had Bernie been president. And those you know, these coup attempts, these ongoing coup attempts in the global South, like these sorts of things wouldn't be happening under a Bernie presidency where you have a world power actually represented by somebody that invests into, you know, into working people, into the middle class, the poor, someone that actually cares about people. You wouldn't see what the U.S. foreign policy has been over the past, you know, 60 years. So I think that would be a massive improvement. And I think you completely nailed it there.
And I mean, yeah, 100%, right? Like, I mean, the Canada doesn't always follow the U.S. foreign policy lockstep, but we do follow it pretty closely generally. And so you're right that because like, not only is Bernie Sanders the most left-wing, you know, presidential candidate probably since Eugene Debs, he's definitely the most left-wing on foreign policy, like since Debs as well, right? Like, and so imagine if it's not just somebody who's ostensibly left-wing in terms of wanting to give people health care, but like left-wing in terms of how America relates to the world. That will shape Canada's foreign policy globally, but I think specifically in Latin America.
Absolutely. Christo, where can people find you?
Well, people can find me on Twitter. It's just Christo Aivalis. David will have the name in the description. It's just that, all one word. Same thing on Facebook. You can find me there. YouTube, the channel's name is just Christo Aivalis. And you can find me covering Canadian politics more now lately because of the U.S. election. I've been talking a lot of Bernie Sanders. So I think if you like David's stuff, you'll probably like my stuff too.
That's true. Christo does awesome work. Check out his channel, subscribe. And again, I'll have all the links below in the description box. Check him out. Christo, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.